Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, if you want to pick a side in the Ukraine story, just pick a channel. There's something for everyone. Protesters in Thailand want just one side of that story told, so they've given journalists there their marching orders. We'll drill down into the coverage of the economic story in Greece, where the media are a battleground, and the joy of selling out. I need the money. That's our web video of the week. With his troops occupying the region, President Vladimir Putin's visit to the Crimean capital on May 9th saw him greeted as a hero. The date, the anniversary of the end of World War II, was significant because back home on Russian television screens, Putin's policy in Ukraine is depicted as a valiant stand on behalf of Russian speakers there against the same kind of fascism Russia fought in the Second World War. In fact, 300 of the Kremlin's favorite journalists now have medals to show for their work on the Ukraine story. That kind of coverage has been dismissed as propaganda in the West, but you don't have to go all the way to Moscow to find biased journalism that reflects and even parrots what domestic political leaders are saying about this crisis. On the ground, Ukraine has been a tough story to report from the start, with journalists being attacked and kidnapped. Nuance, context, and subtlety have all been among the early casualties of an all-out propaganda war. Our starting point this week is Sevastopol.
The Russian media are covering the events according to the aspiration of a Russian audience.
The coverage of the Western press was the most unobjective.
Watching them digging trenches in eastern Ukraine makes one think of World War I.
What has really startled me is the vehemence of the coverage. And that really is almost a metaphor for the Ukraine situation itself.
Here is just one example of that. A demonstration in Donetsk ends in fighting between pro- and anti-Russian forces. One story, two versions, depending on whether the channel you're watching is coming at you from east.
5000 фанатов отправились на площадь Свободы, где митинговали представители антимайдана и напали на мирных демонстрантов.
Or west.
Armed and menacing, the pro-Russian camp guaranteed that they are the absolute authority.
The Russian media is depicting those who overthrew Yanukovych as fascists and Nazis, but they are a minority, and the Russians are perfectly well aware of that. They are trying to misrepresent what's going on.
It is not information war. It's just an exchange of information. But the audience in different parts of the world, of course, can have their own assessment, and when some bias is on one side, then you can decide who is on the top in this information media space.
On the other hand, I think Russian press was not completely objective, in the sense that, especially from the TV reports, you might get an impression that all the Maidan activists were Western agents. In very much the same way, sometimes from the Western reports, you get an impression that there is no protest movement in the east of Ukraine. These are all Russian agents or disguised Russian civilians.
The idea, I think, is to create a general climate of chaos, then to claim that the Russian army has to go in.
And this is all untrue, of course.
There is almost a sort of media-driven zero-sum game. Zero-sum game means that whatever you say in your interest is by definition contrary to my interest, and that's, I'm afraid, one of the more regrettable aspects of this whole crisis.
The people of Ukraine may well decide their own future at the ballot box someday, but for now, that future is being shaped by the geopolitical debate in the global media. RT is Russia's Kremlin-funded global English-language news channel, and it's made news in its coverage of the Ukraine story.
The propaganda bullhorn that is the state-sponsored Russia Today program has been deployed to promote President Putin's fantasy about what is playing out on the ground.
Had Ukraine erupted 20 years ago, Washington could have controlled the narrative much more easily, because at the time, all global English-language news channels were based in the West. But times have changed.
People in Russia understand that RT is a well-financed propaganda operation and directed toward the West, because there's been decades of this type of first Soviet and then Russian propaganda directed against the West. So I don't think anybody in Russia is surprised. They know how the Russian government treats its own journalists and Western journalists. As for calling RT a propaganda bullhorn, I don't know that it necessarily solves anything to state the obvious, but on the other hand, it does get annoying when people pose as legitimate journalists when in fact they're not.
I am surprised at that dismissal of Russia Today as a mere propaganda organ for two reasons. First of all, I don't think it's uncharitable to say that most of the Western press can be seen as a propaganda organ for our side of things. And second of all, I've been in Russia Today a couple of times, and I found their questions to be thoughtful, penetrating, certainly not high, easy pitches to hit out of the ballpark in support of the Russian position. I think there's a general desire to understand what the Western attitudes are. If anything, it's more a cause of bewilderment or surprise at the one-sidedness of Western coverage.
This story got big play in the New York Times, largely because of the accompanying photographs, which were described by both the State Department and the Times as proof that Russian soldiers were on the ground in eastern Ukraine. The pictures, it turns out, were taken in Russia. They proved nothing. The initial story got front-page coverage in America's most influential newspaper. The retraction, such as it was, came 2 days later and was buried on page 9.
What I found just as significant as the original mistake was the quote apology unquote that the Times offered. I have actually the quote in front of me. A collection of photographs that Ukraine says shows the presence of Russian forces in the eastern part of the country, and which the United States cited as evidence of Russian involvement, has come under scrutiny. It seems to me that in the principles and ethics of journalism, you put under scrutiny a story before you print it, especially when it's so potentially volatile and inflammatory as this particular story and photographs that prove to be, at the very least, misleading.
This story just reflects the situation with the Western media and its relation to the Western governments in general. It was quite obvious that the Western governments didn't want to believe that there is a strong opposition movement to the new authorities in Kiev in eastern Ukraine. And this was, of course, wrong. So there is an indigenous protest movement in the east of Ukraine, and the Western media just didn't want to recognize it. They didn't want to see it because the Western governments were not prepared to recognize this movement's existence.
One final point. The U.S. State Department wrote an official blog on RT, which it called a key player in Moscow's campaign of distortion. The writer was an Under-Secretary of State, Richard Stengel, the former managing editor of Time magazine. It is fair to say that a Kremlin-funded news channel may be less independent than U.S. media on the Ukraine story. But you don't have to be funded by a government to do its bidding. And the American media have a sorry record for failing to keep their distance from administrations past and present. Perhaps Mr. Stengel could write a blog on that sometime. Just don't hold your breath. Our Global Village voices now on the news coverage of the showdown in Ukraine.
The split in the media coverage was totally predictable because we know that many Russian media are pro-Kremlin, and they put this illegal referendum in a good way, but many Ukrainian journalists, many Ukrainian media put it like in a way that this referendum should never happen in the east of Ukraine.
In the Ukrainian media, the people struggling for independence have been called criminals and terrorists, whereas in the Russian media, the government in Kiev are called nationalists and fascists, suppressing the rights of Russian speakers. The really sad truth is that most people here have no access to objective media at all.
Media has played a pretty significant role in deepening the Ukraine-Russia divide. I mean, both sides have portrayed the other as extremists and haven't sought out any kind of more moderate or more nuanced kind of voices or viewpoints. Assumptions from history have kind of acted as a filter for both sides and have influenced, editorial positions.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. Now that Thailand's Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra has fallen, anti-Shinawatra protesters are trying to control the news coverage of what remains of her government. Shinawatra was ousted by a constitutional court May 6th, which found her guilty of abuse of power. 3 days later, 5 of the country's biggest networks had protesters on their doorsteps. Those protesters infiltrated the state-owned broadcaster NBT and demanded the channel stop using government sources and start broadcasting the message of the opposition group, the PDRC. The New York-based Human Rights Watch said that PDRC protesters, occupation of television stations, and threats against the media are not only illegal, but show an ugly disregard for freedom of the press. Press freedom is about allowing all views to be heard, not just those of one side. Anti-Shinawat forces are also talking about finally dismantling the media network built by Thaksin Shinawat, who was toppled in a coup in 2006, but whose movement keeps winning elections. The 25th anniversary of China's Tiananmen Square massacre is coming up next month, and there are signs that the authorities in Beijing are taking steps to silence some of the critical voices in the media. First, the state-run news agency Xinhua reported that Guo Yu, a prominent reporter, had been jailed for leaking state secrets. The 70-year-old was seized from her home in the capital last month, accused of supplying a confidential document to a foreign website. That document reportedly details Beijing's plans for continued economic reform while preventing the spread of democracy. Following the arrest, the state-run news channel CCTV aired footage of a confession by a woman said to be Yu. A foreign ministry spokesperson argued the arrest was carried out because the journalist had broken Chinese law. On May 11th, protesters in Hong Kong demanded Guo Yu's release. That same week, Yao Wentian, a publisher in Hong Kong who was due to release a book critical of the Chinese president Xi Jinping, was sentenced to 10 years in jail on smuggling charges. His son, Edmund Yao, told the New York Times there is no question that they are trying to punish him for his public activities through normal criminal charges. After more than 260 days in a Cairo prison and reportedly more than 100 days into a hunger strike, video footage has finally appeared of Al Jazeera Arabic's journalist Abdullah El-Shami.
If anything happens to me, my health fails totally, or anything happens to my safety, I hold the Egyptian regime the responsibility of that.
The video was somehow recorded in what looks like El-Shami's prison cell. 3 other Al Jazeera journalists with the network's English-language news channel also remain in Egyptian jails, but at least those 3 have been charged. El-Shami has not. Al Jazeera has called the arrests farcical and an affront to justice. For the most part, Egyptian media have backed the government's approach to journalism, which made the following comments delivered by a popular and outspoken television host, Amra Adib, noteworthy.
ايا كان مشكلتك معاه وانتوا عارفين ان انا وقناه الجزيره يعني مش حبايب لانه لو كل واحد فينا راح بلد يبعت تقرير او يبعت حاجه وهي مش عاجب كان كل نص صحفيين مثلا اتسجنت.
Just prior to the release of El-Shami's video, the frontrunner in the Egyptian presidential elections, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, made a speech to newspaper editors in which he warned them that now is not the time to push for freedom of speech, that Egypt still needs to work towards a more complete democracy. The White House may have learned a thing or two about hashtag campaigns over this past week and how such campaigns can be hijacked by just about anybody. Michelle Obama jumped on the back of the For the Kidnapped Schoolgirls in Nigeria initiative with a Bring Back Our Girls hashtag of her own. That was retweeted more than 60,000 times, but there were some people out there accusing the administration of some selective empathy, so they went to work. Hashtag Bring Back Our Drones was one rewrite. Then there was hashtag Nothing Will Bring Back the Children Murdered by My Husband's Drone Strikes. The moral of the story, one person's hashtag is just another's blank slate. Just a few years ago, Greece had 11 television channels. That's roughly 1 channel per million people. It had 71 radio stations and more than 20 national newspapers. Since 2011, when the country's economic crisis began, there has been carnage in the media sector. More than 4,000 journalists have lost their jobs, and many others have taken big pay cuts. One of those journalists, Aris Hagistefanou, was fired for what management called economic reasons. He says it was because he refused to toe the editorial line on the media's pro-austerity narrative. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro sat down with Hagistefanou in London to get the story behind the coverage of the austerity push, the Greek media's own financial crisis, and the cumulative effect on freedom of expression in the birthplace of democracy.
Aris Hagistefanou, thank you very much for coming to the Listening Post.
Thank you for having me.
Job cuts, shutdowns of channels, shutdowns of newspapers. The media landscape in Greece has been affected by the financial landscape. Could you explain to us what it was about the structure of the media industry in Greece that led to this bubble to burst so dramatically?
The main problem with Greek media landscape is that these organizations were never really profitable. They could receive cheap loans from the banks and they could rely on public infrastructure. After the beginning of the crisis, when the advertisement market collapsed, it was only big banks that they had some money to pay for advertisement in private stations. And at the same time, they were the only one who could give money as loans to these corporations. So what's the result of that? Greek taxpayers pay for bailing out the banks who give money to the mainstream media to promote their propaganda and to promote the idea that we should support austerity and that we should bail out the banks. So you see here this vicious circle.
There's a larger point here about media ownership. We've seen countries, for example, like Turkey. Media outlets are owned by big conglomerates that do business with the government. How do you think coverage of political stories are affected by these kinds of relationships?
If you see the latest report from organizations like Reporters Without Borders, you'll see that after the beginning of the crisis, we fell 50 places in the index of press freedom. Can you imagine that? 50 places. We have now many countries that are non-democratic regimes and they enjoy more freedom of press than what journalists enjoy in the country where democracy was born.
One of these stories coming out of the media has been the shutdown of state TV, ERT. It was taken off air last year. Now, the government's argument is that it's financially unviable. What would you say to that?
It's a huge lie. If you see the information that we received from journalists working at ERT, with a very small budget, they had more than 5 radio stations, they had 2 TV stations promoting information to all corners of Greece. Even though it was owned and controlled by the state, I would say that ERT was less biased than private TV stations, and that was something that the Greek government could not accept anymore.
Most of the people we speak to tend to say that state media usually doesn't favour the public and tends to back the government. You seem to be arguing, however, that there was a valuable contribution being made journalistically by this channel instead of it just being a mere vehicle of the state.
Many people characterize the ERT as a propaganda machine, and at some points it was true. They promoted the same austerity agenda, they promoted the same politicians for years and years. But if you compare it with the private channels, then you realize that there was a higher level of journalism in the state broadcaster. ERT didn't have to rely on other private corporations to get money from advertisement or loans from the banks. So it had an independence that you cannot find in the private sector. You know, there was a joke a few years ago, which is not a joke, unfortunately, anymore, that our parents and our grandparents had to rely on BBC World Service or Deutsche Welle to understand what's going on in their country during the German occupation or during the dictatorship. I'm afraid the same thing happens now in Greece. We have to watch Al Jazeera or BBC or read The Guardian to learn what's going on a few hundred meters from our houses.
3 years ago, you were sacked from Sky Media, one of the biggest outlets in Greece. They say the reason was economic. You say it was because you refused to toe the line. What story was it that you were trying to tell?
What I was doing, it was just to work on international affairs. So I was explaining what was happening in countries like Ecuador, Iceland, where they defaulted, where they didn't accept what the IMF was asking from them, or they nationalized the banks, or they stopped being members of monetary unions in the same way that we are members of Eurozone. There are hundreds of journalists promoting alternative points of view to current affairs that lost their position in mainstream media. I think that the crisis was a unique opportunity for media owners to get rid of people who wouldn't accept the austerity policy, wouldn't accept what the Greek government wanted to implement against the Greek population.
You've made two films, Deptocracy and Katastroika, and they're both films that are dedicated to telling this story of capital and late capitalism. What is it about your films that's not being said in the mainstream media? And more importantly, why is it that they don't want to discuss it?
In our first documentary, Debtocracy, we were explaining that there are other solutions to debt crisis, that you can default, you can exit the Eurozone or any other monetary union, that it's not a sin to have a debt. It's not the same thing as having a personal debt, because that's what the media are trying to say to countries that find themselves in the trap of debt. No one wanted to listen about this story in Greece, and probably it's not a coincidence that many journalists that we worked for this documentary lost their jobs during a very small period of weeks or months.
One question about you, the way that you do your documentaries, the voices that you line up, they're all very much part of the left. You do not use a model which suggests a counterpoint. So this is very much a mode of denunciation. Do you not feel that there's a problem with that kind of representation?
From the first moment, we explained to our viewers and to our audience that we are not going to be balanced in the way that someone would expect to have both opinions at the same documentary. And why we did that? We said to the people that you are listening to the other point of view, from the mainstream media every single day. You are reading for that in the newspapers, you are listening to the same stories at 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock news. So we have enough time to bring you the other side of the story, to bring you alternative solutions.
Aris Hadjistefanou, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
Finally, it wasn't so long ago that in the world of pop music, artists, those who claimed to have some integrity, wouldn't even think of allowing their songs to be used in television commercials because, artistically speaking, that was seen as selling out. Well, those days are gone because the music industry, as we knew it, is gone, and musicians have had to change their tune. John Lajoie is a Canadian musician. He's a comedian, a self-described internet celebrity, and in his latest music video, he's basically begging any advertiser to, as the title says, please use this song. With nearly 2 million hits online, we've made it our web video of the week, and we'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Office supplies, a brand new hair dye, a dating website, a suicide hotline, a new way to exercise, a preview for a movie that is coming out in July, a political campaign, a new video game, a medication that you didn't know you should be taking. Any product, any service, this is